So if you go to WebEx and you go to the modules, there is material. I'll talk to you after class and I'll scan you in, okay? There is material that we are not going over in the lecture. And this is important material. This is Henry VIII. This is the formation of the Church of England. This is Queen Elizabeth, etc. And these are important topics. They're on the test, and I want you to understand them. And so go in there, click on modules. You will see a big chunk of notes, and they are to be studied. I don't know exactly when we will have our first test. All I'll say is soon, okay? That being said, I'm never going to say the test is the next class meeting, okay? I'll always give you one extra meeting to prepare for it. But expect our first test to come up here pretty soon because we are well into the semester now. Okay, that being said, today I want to discuss the emergence of the modern states. Okay, I want to discuss the emergence of nations that we would understand compared to their modern counterparts. And if we were to get into our DeLorean and go 88 miles an hour and head back to them, they would, be what they are today. And with that, I also want to discuss the emergence of absolutism. The emergence of absolutism. The 17th century will be called the age of absolutism. And what do I mean by that? Well, we all know what a king is. Big fancy clothes and the crown and the palace, and everybody, does the Your Majesty thing. It's very important that you understand that not every king actually has tremendous amounts of power. The title of being king varies greatly in terms of what it means from one country to the next. Sometimes kings are nothing more than figureheads. Yes, they live in a fancy palace and everyone, shows them all of the respect, but there isn't actually any power behind the throne. And sometimes it's a mix. But of course, sometimes the king really will be the all-powerful ruler of a country. The king really will have agency over everything, the way we might think a king actually would be. And during the age of absolutism, a number of European states would develop this kind of government. A government where the king has absolutely no check on his power of any kind. What he says is law right then, no discussion, no debate. And the reason we need to understand this is because we are going to compare it to other types of government and see what works best. It's certainly good to be the king if you are an absolute monarch, but at the same time, is that necessarily the right way to run a country? Well, let's look at it. And the first modern state that I want to look at that will embody absolutism, that will be the very definition of an absolute monarchy, is France. The very definition of an absolute monarchy will be France. Now, everybody in here knows that France has been around a long time. Everybody in here knows that France has a rich and complex history. And France had a king for a very, very long time. Not anymore, of course. What we need to understand is that there is no rule in France. There is no law or tradition or anything else that defines the power of the king. The king could be a figurehead, the king could be absolute, or somewhere in the middle. It's all about the era that we're living in. There's no legal definition of what role the king is really supposed to play. And early French kings were very weak. Early French kings truly controlled a very small amount of land, even though they were technically the king of the country. Now, who do you think is really running all of the other land if the king isn't boss man? If he's just a figurehead, who are the other people that might run other regions of France instead of him?
The church?
Well, the church is an embodiment over everyone, and the church has a tremendous amount of power. That is absolutely true. And the church will enact its own rules and laws and customs on the people, but those aren't political. Those are spiritual, right? And so who are the people that will run, politically speaking, different regions of France if the king is not actually exerting his power over them?
Are
Other noblemen?
Bingo. Other nobility. France has a complex noble class, and these individuals over time develop significant wealth and power of their own. Many have their own private armies. There will be times in France when there are noblemen that are themselves vastly more wealthy and powerful than the king himself. And I'll just tell you very quickly, you don't even have to write this down. On paper, obviously the king is nobleman number one. We know that. He's supposed to be top dog of the noble class. What is the noble rank that is beneath a king? If you're not a king, what's on tier 2? What are you? What are you called? You're called a prince, right? A prince is number 2. Now, a prince can be the sons of the king, the eldest of which is going to end up being the next king, right? But there's a few other men that might end up being princes as well. Let's say your dad is the king, but you're the younger son. You're still a prince, and then your sons end up being princes too because they're the grandsons of the king. But of course, your older brother and his family were really the ones that are going to end up being the next king, right? And so you are cousins of the king in the direct line, but you're not necessarily going to be king yourself. I mean, it could happen, but it's very unlikely. You get where I'm coming from, right? And so you can have a generational thing where a few different men can call themselves prince without realistically expecting to ever be king. And these are, needless to say, particularly wealthy, powerful, important, noble. France even has a title called Princes of the Blood. And if you are a prince of the blood, then you are a prince who could realistically be king. You're the son of the king, so to speak. So you would be in line for the throne. If you're not a prince of the blood, you're a grandson of an earlier king or something like that. So yeah, you're a prince, but don't expect to ever wear the crown. Now, does anybody know the noble rank that is, and frequently princes would also have this title, just to let you know. Frequently a prince would carry this title because all these people are related to each other. What's beneath a prince? A duke. A duke is beneath a prince. Now, dukes are particularly important themselves. Okay, there's only a handful of dukes in France. Many of them have vast amounts of land, big armies, lots of wealth. There were times when dukes were more powerful than the king. In some parts of Europe, if a country is particularly small, if it's not a very big country, it won't be ruled by a duke. It won't be ruled by a king. It will be ruled by a duke. It's not a big enough country to be called a kingdom, so it's going to be what is called a duchy. It is going to be what's called a duchy, and that's just a little country, and the duke is the king, if you will. He just doesn't have enough land and power to be considered a king. Now, just to let you know, there is a title that is bigger than a king, although, well, France will eventually assume that for Napoleon, but there is an individual who is technically more than a king, and what are you if you are higher ranking than a king? And France, of course, again, the highest rank in France is the king, but other countries will have this. An emperor. An emperor is a king of many different nations. Okay, if you rule over many different peoples and are theoretically a king of more than one country, you are what is known as an emperor. And this is kind of a vague term, but you know an emperor when you see one, so to speak. The Austro-Hungarian Empire will have an emperor because he rules over many different peoples. The Tsar of Russia is an emperor. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire is an emperor. You get the idea. And that is when you have multiple kingdoms and you're the king of all of them. You're the king of all of them. And there's actually one person today on this earth that still has the title of emperor. And does anybody know what country that is? There's one emperor left in the world today. Does anybody know? Purely a figurehead, by the way.
Is it the Queen of England?
No, she's not an empress. No, she's not an empress. The last emperor or empress of England was George VI, before Queen Elizabeth. He was an emperor, but she's not because of India. But does anybody know? Japan. Japan has a monarch, and the monarch of Japan is considered the emperor of Japan. He is not the king. Now, the Japanese people are all one people, but they've decided that he's going to be an emperor, and so that's his title. You know, he is the emperor of Japan. And the last emperor before him was the emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie. He got kicked off the throne in the 1970s. And of course, you got to go back a lot farther. You got to go back to World War I, and a whole bunch of emperors ended up losing their empires. But just understand, there's a rank higher than a king, and that is emperor. Anyway, so what are we getting to here? Well, in 1610, Louis XIII becomes king of France. In 1610, Louis XIII becomes king of France. He was a perfectly competent person. We don't have to talk about him a whole lot. If you look at how he is dressed, you see all sorts of imagery that indicates his power over you. This little medallion cross thing here is the symbol of the French monarch. So you know you're looking at the king because of that. The staff represents justice. Why is he wearing this schmancy ceremonial armor? He never saw a battlefield. France is long past the point where kings fight on the battlefield, but why is he all dressed up in this schmancy armor? What's he really trying to say? What's the message? I have power. I have an army, right? I am the military ruler of this country. I am not personally a soldier, only in a symbolic way. Only in a symbolic way. But you'll notice he's got the sword, he's got the staff, I am the king, I am an armor. This is obey me, if you think about it. That's what this message is. You will obey me. I will use my sword and I will use my armor if you don't. And the fleur-de-lis, which is seen on his robe, is the symbol of the Bourbon family. And we all know it as the New Orleans Saints, the lily flower. And if you don't know the connection between Louisiana and France, he's King Louis. And what state did I just mention? Louisiana. Okay, there's a reason why it's called Louisiana. Anyway, well, kings have a right-hand man. Kings have a prime minister or an assistant or whatever you want to call it. And that was the case in France as well. Every king does. And for Louis XIII, his right-hand man was the head of the French church, Cardinal Richelieu. The head of the French church. Richelieu believed that the king should hold all power, period. Richelieu was a firm believer in absolutism. The people of France are like children, and the king is like their father. He is the father of his people. The king gets his authority from God. God chose him to rule. That is called divine right. And you French citizens will obey him. That is your duty. He is the boss. You are the worker. Your political loyalty is to him. Your spiritual loyalty is entirely to the church. You are not to dissent. You are not to have an opinion on that. You are not to have your own idea. That is not how it works. And anyone who does not play ball, anyone that does not recognize the absolute authority of the king and the absolute authority of the church is a heretic, is a criminal. The church collects a 10% tax called the tithe on every French citizen. And you are going to pay it. And the king puts his laws on you, and you are going to obey them. Now you say that sounds pretty harsh, and obviously it is, right? But I'm looking at a bunch of young adults, and that was how it worked at home when you were kids, right? Mom and dad are in charge. You're not. You know, they might be kind to you, they might be nice to you and all of that, but they're generally only kind and nice when you're cooperating, aren't they? When you do what they tell you to do, we're good. When you don't do what they tell you to do, we're not. And that's how a family works. Mom and dad are in charge. They set the rules. You are the children. You follow them. We move forward as a family. Order. Stability. If I were to round up a big old group of smart people and say, should a parent be an authority figure who runs the household, who children need to respect? Everyone's going to say, of course. And if I say, should children talk back to their parents and decide that they're in charge and decide that mom and dad aren't the ones who make the rules? Everyone would say, oh, no. That's not how it works, right? That's how our country is run. He is the father, you are the children. Now, there's going to be a group of people that are not necessarily happy with this concept. And I'm not necessarily talking about the people. Again, people like law and order when it really gets down to it. Now, there's eventually going to be a different idea behind this, but plenty of people agree with this concept. The people that are going to be rubbed the wrong way are going to be the nobility. Because if the king is absolute, setting the laws, running the country, the nobility have no power, don't they? The nobility are out on the outside looking in. And that's why the nobility always want a weak king. Nobility always want a weak king. The king always wants weak nobility. That's the seesaw power play that always goes on. And as Richelieu organizes the French government to make Louis XIII in charge of everything, the nobility don't like what they're seeing. Because if the king takes all of the power, if he has the biggest army, if he collects all the taxes, if his law has to be obeyed, even in my duchy, I'm a nobody. Sooner or later, I'm obsolete. Louis died in 1643, and when you see these dates, I'm talking about the dates that they ruled. I'm not talking about the dates that they lived. Keep that in mind. These are the dates that they were actually doing their thing. His son would become Louis XIV, and Louis XIV was about 5 years old. So he was obviously not in a position to rule France on his own. Now, of course, he's got the title and all the ceremony. And here is a childhood portrait of him, and you see the Bourbon, right? The fleur-de-lis, you see the little cross. If you come up here, here is the staff of justice. He is the little king. He's just not the guy that's actually running the show. And everybody, of course, agrees. In these situations, there will be what is known as a regent, an adult who rules in his name until he reaches maturity. And it was another cardinal, a guy named Cardinal Mazarin. Now, you don't have to write him down, but another man who was lockstep with Richelieu was the regent for Louis. And when he died, Louis was about 22 years old, and that is when Louis announced that he would rule for real. When Louis was about 22 years old, he became the actual king, not just in name, but in practice. When Louis was little, when Louis was a small child, the nobility rebelled against him because they saw that their power was being taken away. They saw that they were being stripped of their authority. And they knew that if we don't do something now while he's an infant, we're going to be in real trouble when he gets older. I mean, they saw the writing on the wall. And this is an event known as the Fronde. Now, there are many factors that went into the Fronde. It wasn't just rebelling against absolutism. It's just what's important for our purposes. And obviously, we can't psychoanalyze little Louis. The going interpretation is that this had an impact on him. We know it was violent. We know that there were a few instances where it was real touch and go, fighting in the streets. At one point, rebels broke into the palace and he had to hide. I mean, this was traumatic. And being a small child, he doesn't understand what's going on. I just know that they all hate me and are being mean. I mean, this is the ultimate form of bullying if you think about it. And the going logic is this definitely had an impression on him, and the impression is exactly what we expect. He did not trust nobility. In his mind, these people are not really my friend. They're going to show the respect, and they're going to play the game, and they're going to bow and kneel when they're supposed to. And then if I turn my back, they'll put a knife right in it. These are people that want power from me, and this is a game I'm playing with them. That's the going logic of his reasoning. And so he was going to win that game. And controlling the nobility, making sure that they gave him no trouble, sat at the center of his identity as king. He is going to control them. And when he would grow up, that is exactly what he would do. He would become the master of it. And everything that he did made him the envy of every other king in Europe, because he was so successful at ruling absolutely, controlling the nobility, getting everything he wanted. I mean, he put the pieces together perfectly the way a king would want. So, by the time he reaches 22, 23 years old, France has a very powerful military, perfectly loyal to him. The church is absolutely loyal. Everyone is expecting him to be a true absolute monarch. And so he created a state that was effectively that. He created a state that was effectively that. Here are some examples. All tax collection is done by his people. All tax collection is performed by royal agents. And again, it's on your land, it's on my land, it's everywhere. And he, of course, determines what taxes are. Nobody questions them. All the tax revenue goes to him. Of course, he decides how it gets spent, and it is not public. He does not make any of the financial records public. It is none of your business what the king does with the taxes he collects from you, and you're going to pay him. All business and industry, all skilled production is regulated by the crown. Now, of course, he likes businesses. He wants you to be a craftsman or a businessman, a merchant, or whatever, a skilled professional. You're just going to make sure that you operate with permission from the crown, from the government. Now, that's not to say that he is going to personally approve every, shopkeeper and, carpenter or craftsman or blacksmith or whatever, but you will operate with permission from some sort of royal agent. And if they decide there's too many shoemakers in this town, you're out of business. If they decide you're closing up shop, we don't like you, you're closing up shop, we don't like you. You don't have the freedom and agency to do what you want when you want it. As long as you are a happy little loyal Frenchman, obeying the king, following the rules, and you are liked by the government, you can do what you want. But your freedom to engage in your own business and commerce does not exist. All infrastructure, roads, bridges, canals, ports, etc., are managed by the crown. He decides where roads get built. He decides what ports import what goods, etc., etc. There would be big maps rolled out on big tables. And he would say, build a road there, repair that bridge, import over there. And when he said it, that was it. Got done. The king has decreed it. It is now law. Now, what does that mean? Well, if a particular region is full of people that are grumbling about a particular tax, we'll just close that road then. Nothing will, come in and out without me deciding it does. Or we'll close a port that those people are heavily reliant on. Don't like me? Fine. See if you like that. What happens when you don't obey your parents? They put you in timeout, right? They take away your phone. They punish you because you're not following their rules, and they have the authority to do it. Same thing. Obviously, schools. Now, France doesn't have public schools at this time. That's not how things work. Education is a private matter. If your parents are affluent enough, they will send you to school, but the poor peasants that farm the land are generally illiterate. They are the people most loyal to the king, by the way, because they don't know any better. Schools teach a curriculum that he is approving of. And of course, loyalty to the king is taught from day one. The church manages most schools. Most schools are in some way or another managed by the church. And of course, the church teaches this lockstep. I don't need to tell you that the military, completely loyal. Every officer he will either choose or get rid of. War and foreign policy, we're going to attack them or whatever, it gets done. And internally, if there is any kind of a revolt, if there is any kind of problem, that army is going to stomp you like a bug. Period. France will have the most powerful army in Europe by a mile. And its loyalty to King Louis is without question. But how are we going to control these noblemen? How are we going to keep these noblemen in line? How are we really going to make sure that the nobility don't give me any trouble? Well, of course, being the great and awesome and unbelievably intelligent, powerful, brilliant king that he is going to have a palace that reflects it. France, as far as he is concerned, is the wealthiest nation in Europe. It is the most cultured nation in Europe. France is the very embodiment of enlightened Western civilization as far as he is concerned. The very meaning of what it is to be a civilized person is seen in French culture. And every nation in Europe needs to understand this simple fact. And his palace will reflect this. His palace will reflect this. Louis orders the construction of the grandest palace complex ever conceived. This is not even a palace. This is a small royal city. And it is Versailles. It is Versailles. And the standing order at Versailles for its construction was it is to be bigger, better, grander, more ornate than any palace in Europe without debate. I mean, when you see Versailles, you are not to have any question. This is palace number one in the world, for that matter, not just in France. 50,000 acres of manicured buildings and gardens and such make up Versailles. There's fountains all over the place, which are a really big deal at the time. So many of them, they had to reroute an entire river just to power all of the fountains. And even then, there wasn't enough hydraulic power to do it, so they had to have a series of valves. Now understand, a fancy schmancy royal palace somewhere in Europe is going to have a nice big fountain in the front, and that is, something that the king is very proud of. Fountains are a big deal, so Louis is going to have a dozen of them. You get the idea. I'm not going to have one. I'm going to have them all over the place. Nothing like that had been done before. Nothing like that had ever been conceived of before. At any given time, roughly 3,000 people are living at Versailles, and this includes servants. This includes foreign diplomats and all of their entourage. And the whole point is for them to be blown away by Versailles, so when they go back home to the foreign country, the first thing they say is, this place is crazy rich. You're not going to declare war on France when you take a look at the power of King Louis, and Versailles is the embodiment of it. But what really matters about Versailles, a core function of Versailles, is to control the nobility. You see, for the first time, the nobility are going to be expected to live with the king. Up to this point, nobility lived, wherever they live. You've got your fancy land somewhere and a fancy manor house, and life is good. Now you live at Versailles with King Louis. This is a standing order. And everything at Versailles is engineered to serve the king and to honor the king and to show deference to the king. The entire court is about this. And just to let you know, that term is important. Okay, that term is important. Every king in Europe has a court. Every king in Europe has a court. And the king's court are his entourage, are the people that are in the club with him. They are the nobility, and they are the foreign diplomats. So if you are sent by another country to represent England or wherever to France, you are a member of the court whenever you are there. So there's lots of people living at Versailles, but only certain individuals can be called a member of the court, kind of like being in the club. Everybody else is some sort of servant or some sort of worker or some sort of ancillary individual. And if you are a nobleman, you are in the court and you are living at Versailles with me. And so a big part of its gigantic size was to provide accommodations for all of these individuals and their own entourages. You know, if you're a duke, you don't show up by yourself. You show up with all of your servants that are there to serve you. You get the idea. Well, everything at Versailles is ritualized, designed to honor Louis. Everything. And let me tell you, Versailles is just immaculate. If it looks like gold, it is gold. If it looks like silver, it is silver. If it looks like marble, it is marble. No expense is to be spared. There is no accurate number on what it cost to build because all of those records went to Louis. And of course, again, Louis doesn't make that stuff public. He destroyed them, as a matter of fact. And it is worth noting that Versailles was so grand that it really never got finished in his lifetime. The core of it got finished, and he moved in and, you know, all the important parts, but a lot of the side stuff was still not even finished when he died. He worked on it for decades. So, here are just some examples. Again, we have the fountains were the talk of Europe. Again, one fountain at a palace is a big deal. The fact that they are everywhere is just stunning. You know, just corner to corner manicured, corner to corner. Some rooms in it are worth noting. This is the Hall of Mirrors. It is the grandest room at Versailles. One side are windows out onto the formal gardens. The other side are the showpieces of the room itself, and those are the mirrors. At the time, mirrors could only be made small. There's only, you know, the technology just wasn't there, and so small mirrors were the only thing that craftsmen could make. And ordinary people could not own a mirror. A mirror was a very expensive object that only wealthy people could have. And even then, I mean, a small little mirror is the best you can do. And so if you want a big body mirror, you would have to put cells together, and a full body mirror was very, very expensive. Louis ordered huge single pane mirrors to line the wall. Now, understand, when he ordered this, it was not even technically possible. He said, you're going to have human, full, you know, body-size mirrors. Yes, they cannot even be built, and I'm lining the walls with them. I'm lining the walls with them. One would have been the talk of Europe. It's just going to be a huge room, one after another. Nobody knew how to even build them, but when Louis says, get it done, there were some Italian craftsmen that figured out how to do it. But everything at Versailles had to be French. Everything. Comes from France, made by French, etc. And so what he did is he brought these Italian craftsmen in, made them French citizens, and had them build the mirrors in France so that he could say these are French mirrors built by Frenchmen. And you know, it's very, very tragic because right after all the mirrors were done, all of them died accidentally. They all just, you know, they all died. And that means, of course, they couldn't build them for anybody else. Nobody else in Europe gets to have these mirrors because tragically every one of them met their end accidentally. It stunned Europe. When the people would return back to their home countries, they would not be believed when they said there is an entire room with floor-to-ceiling mirrors. You know, there were entire acre after acre. People thought they were embellishing. People thought they were lying. Here is the Queen's bedroom. The King and the Queen have separate bedrooms. More than one reason for this. First of all, the King and the Queen may not necessarily be a romantic couple. These are arranged marriages. The Queen is there to have children and produce the next king, but that doesn't necessarily mean that she is his love interest. The kings would have their own girlfriends and mistresses, and goodness knows Louis had plenty of those. But also because the King and the Queen get dressed in the morning and are, you know, in various states of undress with servants and workers, the king's servants can't be in the room when the queen is in an intimate way. And so she has her own servants that are female, and we'll get into that. And so those kinds of things were done separately in their own bedrooms. And I mean, this room is just, you can just see the bling all over it, right? There's a secret door right there. You can almost see it in this picture that is a little hideaway, getaway, just in case she's got to get out of there real quick. What are these little benches for? Anybody know? Can anybody guess what those benches are for? They're very important. Anybody guess? Those are the observation benches for when the queen gives birth. She gives birth in this room. And everybody's in there when she gives birth. This is not a private affair. It's a big old crowded room. And because, who the next king is such an incredibly important thing, there's going to be, Johnny Benches, okay, lady, bring him out, right? And they have to watch to make sure that the baby that is born is the baby that everybody says it is. It did come out of the queen, and it can be verified. If you think being a queen is fun, I can assure you it had its challenges. Anyway, moving on. Because everything at Versailles is orchestrated around service to him, he just is the puppet master. Everything is a ceremony honoring the king in one way or another. Best example is the rising ceremony in the morning. The king gets up. It's a big deal. When the king starts his day, that is when life at Versailles begins. So the king doesn't just get out of bed. There is a proper way for the king to arise in the morning. So what happens, and you don't have to write this down, but of course, the king is too important to be woken up by just any old schmuck. You are selected if you are important enough to wake the king in the morning, and you are going to be a great nobleman, almost certainly a duke. It's a big honor. You were selected to raise the king. So, of course, you go in there with the morning, and there's others with you, too, because somebody else has been selected to bring him his slippers. Somebody else has been selected to bring him his wig and his robe. Great honor. Ooh, it's a great honor. You are in his bedroom. Greatest polite behavior is extended to his majesty. And you are so grateful that such an honor has been bestowed upon you. And, of course, there will be a priest there that gives him communion. He even had his childhood nurse in there until she died. His entire life, even once he became an adult, the woman that looked after him as an infant was always with him to kind of give him a quick little good morning health check. But it's a big deal. Everything is done in order and properly. And then, of course, when he exits the room and he is prepared, he would walk down the hall of mirrors. Who's going to be there? You're going to be there. The nobility had better be there. It would be incredibly insulting for the king to start his day and you not be there to wish him well. And of course, how do you dress when you are in the presence of his majesty? You dress like you're in the presence of the king. That's how you dress. You don't throw on a quick pair of pants and a shirt. You dress properly always when you are in his presence. So you're lining the walls. Of course, you've been waiting there for who knows how long for him to come out, and that means, of course, you had to get up a lot earlier than him, didn't you? Well, that was a lot of fun. Walking down the hall, and of course, what do you do when the king walks past? You bow. And ladies and gentlemen, when you bow to Louis XIV, you do it right. If you're going to not be too happy with being there, so you're going to do it, but you know what I'm saying, life is about to get a lot more difficult. So he's walking, and everybody, oh, hey, how you doing? Yeah, good morning, buddy. All right. Oh, my gosh. His Majesty said good morning to the Duke of whatever. I don't know what. Well, you have the favor of the king. Everybody likes you. You're now the most popular guy at Versailles. Everybody wants to be your friend, man. I don't know what it is, but he likes you. And later on in the day, he invited you to go hunting with him. Oh, my gosh. Talk about top of the ladder now. All of a sudden, you're the most popular guy because you got the favor of his majesty. Now, of course, a week later, he's walking down, and you're a happy guy, man. Yeah, I'm a friend of the king. I said, whatever, man. I don't know about you. Oh, hey, how you doing, buddy? Oh my gosh, boy, the room clears when you walk in. You might as well have leprosy. Okay, it's like I don't know what you did to make him angry, but boy, I'm not going to sit next to you, right? He's playing a game with everybody, right? What happens if your wife decides to be a bit catty? What if your wife doesn't like what she's having? She's a duchess or whatever. Well, you better straighten her out pretty darn quick because her behavior reflects on you. So if your wife doesn't do what she's supposed to do or insults somebody that he doesn't want to be insulted, boy, he will drop the bomb on your entire family. And so everybody follows the rules. Every dinner is a huge deal, down to where everybody gets to sit. The closer to the king, the better. Oh, boy, you're important. Y'all got to sit next to the king. Oh, and by the way, I like you again. Come on back, right? Just going to go back and forth. Play the game. Keep you constantly on edge. Do you have the king's favor or not? Members of the king's court get to wear red shoe heels. They get to have red heels on their shoes. You don't have to write this down. You know, the nitty-gritty is just for you to know. Now, what's going on here? Well, there's a lot of people at Versailles. And so knowing who is a member of the court and who isn't is kind of important. And so you wear red heels when you are a member of the court. So when you're clomping around, well, you're an important person and that guy over there is not, because everybody's dressed fancy and schmancy. But of course, if I don't like you, no red heels for you. Now, you're a nobleman and you're important and you've got a title, but I'm so angry with you, no more red heels. So what does that mean? That's a scarlet letter or a non-scarlet letter. And you still got to live at Versailles. You still have to be there. You still have to go through the ceremony. And everywhere you walk, everybody sees no red heels for him. That's humiliating. And immediately you will do everything possible to be back in the king's favor so you can put the red heels back on. He even had a ceremony for that, where everybody would line up and the person who wishes favor again would go and kneel before him and he would officially forgive you and let you wear red heels again. Think about the psychological game we're playing here. The cattiness. You all watch The Bachelor? You know, where all the girls compete for the guy, like some sort of harem. Y'all love that show. It's awful. Think how catty those girls are, right? How terrible those girls are. They're backstabbing each other and all that. Multiply that by about 10, and you get the stress and social environment that women went through at Versailles. And of course, your rank as a noblewoman has a very real place in how you get treated at Versailles. If you are a duchess, you have a very different role to play than if you're not. Which doors you can enter and leave are based on your rank. Duchesses can go through the front door. Dukes. The earls and their wives cannot. Dukes and duchesses don't necessarily have to stand when certain people enter the room. Stuff like that. It's all a big game. I don't need to tell you that you're going to get sick of this pretty darn quick, right? The big parties and the fun and the good times, the elaborate, fancy meals that you don't have to cook or clean up after. Sooner or later, you're going to be like, I'd really rather just go home, chill out, relax, not have to play this stupid game. You ain't going anywhere. You will play this game. You will do what the king wants. People hated living at Versailles. Lots of gambling took place. You got to have something to do all day. There was hunting and stuff like that, but sooner or later, these people are going to get bored. There were parlor games of all sorts played at Versailles every night, and many, many of these involved gambling. Now think about this. If you're a wealthy, powerful nobleman, you can't be seen as a cheapskate at the tables, can you? Because, of course, that means that you're poor. That means you're having financial problems, and you can't show that at Versailles. And Louis loved seeing people gamble. Louis loved seeing people put fat stacks on the table because that shows off. What's the rule in life? Don't be a chump. Well, now, of course, what happens when you're a heavy gambler? What's going to happen to you? Guaranteed. You're going to go broke, right? Gambling ain't good, folks. You go broke when you gamble. But don't worry. Don't worry. You have nothing to worry about. I understand that you went broke at the tables. I get it. I'm the king, and you are a very important nobleman. You are certainly a beloved member of my court, and the last thing I want is for you to not have money for all of these clothes and for you to not have money to pay all of your servants. Of course, a nobleman is expected to live at Versailles like a nobleman, so what I'm going to do is loan you all the money you need. You need money, old King Louis is going to loan it to you. No problem. And of course, now what's the case?
You owe him.
You owe him. He owns you now. He owns you now because you owe him money. You owe him money. And if you're not gambling, if you're not losing money, people think something's wrong with you. You're not keeping up appearances. If you're wearing the same clothes day in and day out, you obviously are too poor to afford good ones. Can't have that at your side. It's been a long time since I was a woman, but last I checked, you ladies don't like wearing the same dress more than once, do you? And we can't all have, we have to have a different dress at the ball. And so, boy, these are some fancy stuff, and you've got to buy a lot of it. This is the kind of clothing we're talking about. This is from a generation or two later. It's from a movie. But you get the idea. You know, y'all have probably seen these pictures before, all this stuff. Very difficult to keep clean at Versailles because there weren't enough bathroom facilities. And they don't have running water. And so taking baths and dealing with our business is a big problem. Even for the wealthy, powerful people at Versailles. These kinds of personal issues are a real hassle. You know, you're a lot more comfortable in your own home when it comes to that stuff. You know what I mean? Every society has its own definition of masculinity. When you see the men dressed like this, you think, what a little fancy pants there, right? No. You see, in French noble society at this time, masculinity was defined by not having to work, by not having to do manual labor. Dressing in a way that you would never get your hands dirty is a way of showing that I'm a real man. I've got money, I've got power. And so we see the admittedly silly clothing that these men are wearing. This is very masculine. This is very attractive. And Louis encouraged all of this because it's also very expensive. It's also very expensive, and it controls those nobles. You can understand why they hated him, right? Secretly, but there ain't a darn thing they can do about it. Now, monarchs all across Europe are green with envy. Monarchs all across Europe are green with envy. Louis is going to ultimately not be a positive influence on France. Yes. I get my way, or that's the end of it. And so one of his characters, time and time again, he was at war time and time again. He didn't negotiate with other countries. If they don't give him what he wants, he attacks, period. And he waged one war after another, very expensive, very costly, and all of them ended up being mostly pointless. When he died, France was, didn't have more territory of any note. Nothing about France was improved as a result of these wars. But of course, when I say I'm getting my way, my army is going to make it happen. And I'm just writing on this because I need white space. But his most notable war that was such a big blunder was the War of Spanish Succession. And that was fought from 1702 to 1715. I'm sorry if you can't read it. It's the War of Spanish Succession. Now he's an old man by this point. The King of Spain died. There was nobody to become the next king. And so Louis declared war to put a Bourbon on the throne. That's the short answer. Louis wanted a Bourbon to be the King of Spain. So he fought to make it happen. And it was long and it was bloody. And it took about a month for him to figure out that this was a big mistake. But he can't back down now. And so he just kept pouring more and more resources into it. And he did win. finally got a Bourbon on the throne of Spain, and it was pointless. It was meaningless. Spain is a third-rate nation at this time. Having a Bourbon on the throne means nothing. But he fought the War of the League of Augsburg. He fought lots of wars. They just bankrupted France. Versailles was so expensive that it took 52% of all tax revenue just to keep it going. Think about that. Half of all taxes are rolling the situation at Versailles. It's just incredibly wasteful, incredibly inefficient. Instead of roads and bridges and ports, I'm building these giant palaces. I mean, it's just stupid. And by the way, there were other palaces that the king had. Versailles is just palace number one. There's plenty of others around France that are also his. And they're all being maintained to the nines all the time. When Louis died in 1715, the next king was Louis XV. We got Louis XIV, we got Louis XV next. They're all named Louis. You'll have to blame the French for that. And Louis XV was, coincidentally, about 5 years old. Louis was, coincidentally, about 5 years old. And he would grow up at Versailles. He would be an absolute monarch, perfectly intelligent man. He just didn't make any changes to this system of absolutism. And sooner or later, the money isn't there. And France has to start borrowing its money. And he declares all of these wars and bankrupts the nation as a result. And it's kind of like a very fancy wall that's getting eaten up by termites. It looks great on the outside. Wouldn't try to hold my house up with it. One of the interesting things you have to keep in mind is that when you're sitting at a stoplight and somebody pulls up in a real expensive car, that doesn't mean that they have a lot of money. All right? The reason why they're driving a really expensive car, probably that means they don't have a lot of money. Right? Showing off wealth is very different from actually having it. And France looks very wealthy and prosperous and powerful, and nobody has any reason to question it. It's just every year we're getting a little worse and a little worse and a little worse. And it's death by 1,000 cuts on the French economy and the lifestyle of the French people and the French budget. Sooner or later, that's a pot that's going to blow, isn't it? Sooner or later, the bills can't get paid. Sooner or later, we're going to have a crisis. Not today. We'll keep the king's head on for another couple of days. How about it? All right, y'all. I'll see you later. Now, look, there are notes online. Okay, there are notes in the module section. So please go in and read them. Some of this is important, as I said earlier, that is not going to be discussed in class. And so please check it out.